Well, it's not as if I haven't been writing about myself, but I've been writing about myself in completely disguised ways. I mean, one of my novels, I guess it changed man. One of my sons read it and said, this is so much about our family, but that no one would possibly know unless they knew us. So, or, I wrote one YA novel, which was the product of sitting in the car and listening to my kids and their friends talk. So it's not as if I've been completely excluding my own personal experience from the books, but I've never written about myself as I in this way. I mean, yes, I've done magazine articles, the great trip to Sicily I took with my family, blah, 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 but this is quite different. So it really started as a kind of pandemic book. I was taking a walk, we were all in lockdown, and I was taking a walk in the country with a friend of mine. And I told her, I can't remember how it came up, but I told her this story about Tony Russo and what had happened in our weird relationship. And she said, why don't you write it? And it just hadn't occurred to me. It really hadn't occurred to me. I mean, people say like, I know that at the time it was happening, you were taking notes in your head because you knew that someday you were going to write. I wasn't. I really wasn't. I was just experiencing it when it happened. So I started writing it. And the first version of the book, the first draft, was called Whistleblower, and it was just about him. It was just about his experience and his. And then I gave it to my publisher, and he said, "You're not in it. Why are you not in the book since you were there and it's about you?" So then, I mean, in the same way that when you write a novel, if you have a character someplace, and let's just say that I'm the character, you have to back up and say, how did the character get there? And who is that character? And what's the character doing? And hopes and dreams and so forth. So the book expanded sort of laterally to include me, which it wasn't really like that before. So it became a memoir, even though it didn't start out as a memoir. It started out as a kind of almost like a long magazine article about Tony and what had happened to him. And then it became about my life and who I was and what it was like to be that age.
Was there any resistance, like with the benefit of hindsight, within you to self-investigate in the way that you do in this book?
Yeah. It was horrifying. It was horrifying. I mean, as I've said this before, but I realized why I've been hiding behind these fictional characters all this time, because I'm not I'm not comfortable with sort of self-exposure in that way. This is me. And also, because I was writing about a version of myself that was 50 years old, I really found it quite difficult.
And just to clarify, when you say it's a version of yourself that was 50 years old, you mean it was 50 years ago. You were in your 20s. This is your 20s that you're writing about.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I was sort of, I wasn't exactly unsympathetic to that person that I was. I mean, I don't feel like the same person. I really don't. I mean, once, as I say in the book, 4 years after the book ended, I had my first son, and I became a different person. I mean, and since then, I mean, I led this sort of dramatic life before then, and all these things happened. And since then, I've knock on wood, led a kind of calm life. I mean, I live in the country, I have grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. So to get back to that person I was, who took huge risks and didn't think about them, and was much more naive and passive, let's say, and than I am now, took a certain amount of courage, really. And also, I mean, there was really a turning point when I gave some draft to the book, because everything I write goes through, like, I'm not kidding, still at this point, like 40 or 50 drafts. I gave one of the drafts to my husband, and he said, you have to like that girl that you were better than you do. And I went back and thought, that's right, because actually it was me. And I began to feel more sympathy for her and why she was in that situation. And I'm talking about myself in the third person here, why I was in that situation, who I was, what I was doing there. And it changed after that. I mean, the tone of it changed, and the portrayal of myself changed. So that was quite kind of formative and important.
I mean, it feels kind of similar to the old adage that you have to love your characters. Like, you don't have to like what they do, but if you're going to write them well, you have to be able to locate their humanity.
Yeah, yeah. And it was doubly strange because it was me.
Right, right. So you mentioned Anthony Russo a
Uh,
bit ago, and I think for people who are listening, it's quite possible that they won't know who he is, especially
well,
if
it's
they're of a
more
certain
than
age.
yeah, excuse me. It's more than possible because I mean, part of the story that I mean, the bones of the story are he worked at the Rand Corporation with Daniel Ellsberg, and this was in the 1970s,
And
60s.
the Rand Corporation is like a part of the military industrial complex.
Basically, yeah, it's this think tank. It's this think tank which was getting most of its money then. I don't know about now from the Defense Department, the Pentagon. And they were doing studies about Vietnam. They were essentially running the Vietnam War in a certain way from behind the aegis of under the aegis of a think tank. So he'd been an aeronautical space engineer. He'd worked for NASA, and he was already quite radical. I mean, this was during the Vietnam War, so all the people I knew were, and he certainly was. And he had this idea, which many people had at the time, that somehow you could change things from within. So he decided to try and get a job at the Rand Corporation. Now, I mean, when I'm looking back, I think how narcissistic to imagine that one guy is going to change the entire culture of this huge mega zillion-dollar corporation that's feeding off the defense. Nonetheless, that's what he thought. So they sent him to Vietnam, and he was supposed to work on this thing called the Vietnam Motivation and Morale Project, which was to interview North Vietnamese prisoners, soldiers, and to find out essentially what made them tick. Why were they still fighting? Did they refuse to be defeated? Why did they seem so brave? And he interviewed these guys, North Vietnamese, and really fell in love with several of them, with their heroism, with their dedication, with their commitment to what they were doing. I mean, it became clear to them that they really believed what were doing, that they weren't brainwashed, that all the things we've been told weren't true. So he came back to Rand, and he met Ellsberg there, and Ellsberg had also been in Vietnam. And
This is Daniel Ellsberg.
this is Daniel Ellsberg, had also been in Vietnam and also worked for Rand. And Ellsberg had access to the what we call the Pentagon Papers, this Defense Department report. And the Pentagon Papers proved that the government, the U.S. government, had essentially been lying to the American people through 5 presidencies: Eisenhower, Nixon, Johnson, Bush, not Bush, et cetera, 5 presidencies, about why we were in Vietnam. I mean, the lie was we were defending democracy, we were stopping communism, it was Cold War, we were, the last line of defense against the Chinese communism. But in fact, I mean, of course, there was money being made, and we'd gone in there to help the French, originally to help the French maintain their colonial hold on Vietnam. And then when that hadn't worked out for the French, we were already enmeshed. So this whole idea about the quagmire theory, which is still, if you've seen the Ken Burns documentary, they still subscribe.
The one about Vietnam.
Yeah, it still subscribes to this theory, which is we went in there with the best intentions, and then we kind of got stuck and we couldn't get out. Well, this wasn't actually the case. We didn't go in there with the best intentions, and we could have gotten out, and so on and so on. So Ellsberg had the access to all these documents, which proved government lying, and Tony persuaded Ellsberg really to photocopy them. Ellsberg was hesitant, understandably hesitant, and Tony said, "Let's do it. Let's photocopy them and leak them to the press, to the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and so on." So they did it, and things kind of blew up. It was a big scandal. I mean, the thing that's so striking to me now, Brad, and I think it has something to do with not only the book, but with the response to the book, was the thought that at that time, the idea that the government was lying was so shocking to people, and was so, the idea that once the government was exposed as a bunch of liars, everything would change. We would get out of Vietnam. We would, and that was never going to happen. I mean, it was certainly never going to happen. But now government lying is just a joke. It's just a joke. Biden is saying, why didn't anyone fact check the lie, 70 lies that Trump told during the debate or whatever. So government lying is just taken for granted. So, if we look at what's changed over half a century, that's a big one. And I think that it's probably hard now for readers to understand why anyone thought of it as such a big deal. Because it's now, it just seems like some sort of, another piece of 60s idealism that kind of woke up to reality, which is that no one cares.
No one cares that what?
That the government is continually deceiving the voters, the voting public.
Yeah, I think it feels like the government has learned that if you just flood the zone with so many lies that people can't keep up or possibly combat them all, and you have like a media ecosystem that isn't really holding the line.
Yeah, well, it was either Goering or Goebbels that said if you repeat a lie 3 times, it's the truth. So,
Yeah. So you met Anthony Russo, just to place listeners kind of in time and space, in San Francisco in the 1970s. You were, was it in 1974? Forgive me. Like
it was 1973 to 1974. Yeah.
And you were in your mid-20s.
Mm-hmm.
And you had just published your first novel.
Mm-hmm.
And you were a person in their 20s. Like that's very much what this book, that's very much what this book is about. And it's certainly relatable to anybody who's ever been in that age range. There is a freedom and a wildness, but also a sense of destabilization, I think, that often accompanies being 20 something. And you certainly embodied that.
Thank you so much. I mean, that really is a lot of what this book is about, is what it's like to be in your 20s, and what it's like in particular to be a young woman in your 20s, where, as a friend of mine said, and I quote her in the book, 20-year-olds, they're just trying to find the floor beneath their feet. So I was trying this out, I was trying that out. I was living in San Francisco. I was coming back to New York. I lived in Cambridge. So I was just trying to figure out where I belonged and what kind of life I wanted to live and who I was and all these things that now, I think now, there's a certain kind of pressure. I teach in a college and that there's much more pressure on kids to make all those decisions before they're even 19 or 20. But I think then there was some understanding that you had a certain amount of time to figure these things out. And I certainly couldn't have figured it out one more moment earlier than I did.
Well, there's a lot that's recognizable in the book to me. I'm a different generation, but I think, like I said, anybody who's been 20 something can relate. But there are certain aspects of the America that you depict and the San Francisco that you depict that seem like another universe, like cost of living issues, the ability to just live in San Francisco relatively easily.
I know. People had big apartments. Rents were cheap. Gas was cheap. People had, the unimaginable now is that people had extra rooms. No one I know now has an extra room. It's like a guest room. Forget about it. No one can afford it. So there was a kind of, as I say, for like middle-class white kids especially, there was a kind of social mobility that you could go to San Francisco and stay with friends until they got tired of you or go someplace else. And everyone I knew was crisscrossing back and forth across the country a lot. That was just something that people did then. And I did it many times by car, by train, and so forth. So yeah, there was a lot of mobility, and the fact that you could get a job because rents were cheap. You could get any kind of job and pay your rent, and then be some kind of artist if you wanted to be. And also San Francisco, as you say. There's a part in the book that takes place. I had these friends that lived in this abandoned hotel in the Mission District, the Reno Hotel, which had been built for professional boxers in the 19th century. And it was a square block abandoned. And the fire department, the police said, well, you can have it as long as you don't burn it down. So all these writers and artists and designers and architects and filmmakers had just carved out these amazing living spaces, some of them going up 2 stories, and then there was another 2 floors that was like The Shining. I mean, it was just like, but that real estate in the Mission now, that's not going to happen. I
No.
mean, so, the glass and steel buildings that have gone up all over San Francisco have made it completely unrecognizable, or mainly unrecognizable.
And the San Francisco that you arrived in your mid-20s in 1973 was related to the fact that you were leaving an unhappy marriage and a life in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I think you had, I guess, would it be fair to characterize it as like a bit of a breakdown or just like a really deeply unhappy time?
I think it would be fair to characterize it as a bit of a breakdown. Yeah, I mean, I was completely agoraphobic. I mean, that was not a good sign of my mental health.
Right.
And also I was still in graduate school. So I would get up and I'd go to like an 8 a.m. German class, which was required beginning, you had to learn 2 languages in the PhD program. I'd go to German class and maybe one other. And then I'd come home and get high and watch TV for the rest of the day and then do the same thing the next day. So that didn't seem to me like, that I was a paragon of mental health. And I was in the wrong place. I was in the wrong school. I should not have been in academia. I was married to the wrong person. I mean, every decision I'd made had been the wrong one. So I had to really unravel the life that I thought I'd made for myself.
And so you go to San Francisco, and this is where you meet Tony Russo. Can you just talk about the circumstances of your meeting?
Yeah, it was a poker game. I had 2 roommates. In the book, I called them Henry and Grace. And they had one of those houses. We lived in the outer Sunset. They had one of those houses that was like, the center for people to be. I mean, there are always people in the house, and it was this beautiful apartment. And Tony came over to play poker one night. And that's how we met. I mean, it wasn't much of a poker game. I could actually play. It wasn't much of a poker game, but at the end, he and I left together. And again, I mean, this is what I mean about being in your 20s. And I mean, we left together, and our first date or whatever it was, we went to the Sutro Baths, which for people who don't know is this kind of ruined amusement park on the edge of the ocean in San Francisco. And it's essentially these gigantic cisterns in the ground. So there I was standing on the edge of this cistern in the middle of the night with this guy who was already clearly a little unstable. No one knew where I was. And I was like, whatever. I mean, now when I think about it, it's terrifying. But I was just, let's see where this goes.
Yeah, I mean the dates, if that's what you want to call them, that you and Tony would go on, they're a little odd. That often involved you being in his car. He was let's just say, aggressive driver.
Yeah,
like
well, he was a fast driver. There were so few cars on the road then that, I think of aggression as like somebody else. He just went fast, and also because of the hills, it was like, you could just drive like that. So it was like Bullet, the Steve McQueen film where they're chasing it, it's like that.
And you're riding shotgun, just like, okay, let's do this. and
Yeah.
you're talking. But I mean, you do a lot of that. You drive around, you talk, you go to the Martha Washington, which is like in kind of a cafeteria, I think in the Tenderloin.
Yeah, it's a dive cafeteria, basically. Yeah.
And you guys would sit there and drink bad coffee, and he would do most of the talking, and you would do a lot of listening.
He would do pretty much all the talking. And I would
About
do how much his life, Vietnam, mostly about Vietnam, what had happened to him in Vietnam, Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers, and so forth. I mean, he just wanted, people ask me how I was able to remember so much. I can't even call it dialogue, so much monologue from him, but he would often tell the same stories again and again. So it wasn't as if I had to, I had plenty of practice listening to them because I'd heard them quite often.
and he would get emotional. He was, like you said, he's a little bit unstable, and I think it's fair to say that he was traumatized by his experiences at Rand, and I think in particular, as you mentioned earlier, his experiences in Vietnam and his interactions with these prisoners. And there's like, I think there's a poem that he was reciting where the words heart and joy were in the poem, and every time he read it, he got choked up.
Yeah, it was a poem that a Vietnamese prisoner recited to him, and this was a guy who had been in jail for a long time, who'd been a teacher, and he'd gone out and sort of done youth recruitment groups for the Vietnamese North Vietnamese army, and he recited this poem for Tony, and he must have said it quite a number of times because Tony had it from memory, and yeah, he would cry a lot. He would start to cry a lot. But an interesting thing happened. I got a letter early into the book's publication, maybe 2 or 3 weeks after, from Daniel Ellsberg's daughter. And I'd been kind of nervous about it because Ellsberg had died almost precisely a year ago. And I don't really say anything bad about Ellsberg, except that Ellsberg, because Ellsberg was the handsome, commodifiable, acceptable, well-dressed, great haircut, well-spoken guy. And Tony was way to the left of Ellsberg and kind of shaggy and hippie and very, very radical. That Ellsberg really moved into the center of the story. And even though Tony had been very much a part of the story, Tony was kind of edged out of the story. And in fact, this is sort of common knowledge that Ellsberg, Daniel Ellsberg and his wife were very upset that Tony was named on the same indictment as Ellsberg. And they thought that the judge had done it, the court had done it just to annoy them. So, and Tony went to jail for 47 days and Ellsberg never went to jail. So he was, so it was a complicated story. So anyway, I was concerned just because even if I'd only said that Ellsberg failed to give Tony credit for what had happened or how things had happened, that's, it's not the heaviest criticism in the world, but it's critical. Anyway, I got this letter from Ellsberg's daughter saying that was exactly what it was like. That was what Tony was like. And then there's a scene in the novel, which has been verified historically. Ellsberg brought his 2 kids one night when they were photocopying the documents. And she said to me, I was the little girl scissoring the top secret markings off the photocopies. And I was very encouraged when I got her letter because she, if you're writing a memory piece and it's other people are involved, you really want to think you got it right, that you portrayed them correctly, that you didn't make some mistake of perception that skewed everything. And so, as I said, I was very heartened and encouraged when I got her letter. And I've since gotten other letters. I got a letter from the woman I call Grace in the novel, who was my roommate, in the memoir, who's my roommate. And she loved it. And she said, oh, everybody out here's reading it, and we seem so wonderful in the book. So I was thrilled. So, yeah. So, it was very, it was encouraging.
So Russo and Ellsberg, like their relationship, especially after the release of the Pentagon Papers, it's kind of been, or it was kind of a up and down journey, right? It seems like they had kind of a falling out and then maybe reconciled later in life.
Apparently they reconciled. There's a video on, I think you can find it on YouTube, and it's Tony's memorial service. He died in 2008. And Ellsberg is speaking at Tony's memorial service. And Ellsberg recites the poem that Tony used to recite. And interestingly enough, Ellsberg breaks down crying at precisely the same points that Tony did. And the letter from Ellsberg's daughter, she said, oh, my father used to cry quite a lot, which was interesting to me that the two of them. So in that video, Ellsberg says that they reconciled before Tony's death, but I've never heard that from anybody else. I assume it's true, but I just don't know if it's true.
And when you talk about this, these tears that both men were prone to crying, and the trauma that they both experienced having played a part in the war in Vietnam. Like this is, I think, gets to like another core thematic concern of yours, not only in this book, but I think you even refer to this as maybe like the overarching or one of the overarching concerns of your entire body of work is this idea of human beings and their conscience, and they're developing like kind of a moral sense of things. And like when that happens, and if it can change, and if it can happen later in life versus is it just kind of like baked into the cake from an early stage? Is that right?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah. And I feel that I've been writing about that a lot. I have been writing. I mean, A Changed Man, which I mentioned earlier, is about a neo-Nazi who goes and turns himself into a human rights federation because he wants to be the poster boy. And at first it's just a kind of ploy to get over on people and have a sort of new job and somewhere to live. And then gradually his own conscience begins developing as a result. So many, I mean, my last novel, The Vixen, is about a young man who wants to get ahead in publishing in the 1950s, and he's assigned to write, he's assigned to edit this cheesy, bodice-ripping bestseller about the Rosenbergs. And at the beginning of the novel, he's quite willing to do it because he's so desperate, A, to have a career in publishing, and B, to get the approval of his boss, who's this kind of charismatic, old school publisher. And then as the book progresses and as he finds out what's really behind the novel, his conscience kicks in. So many of them, if you look at many of my novels, if you look at them, something happens like that at some point during the novel.
Well, when it comes to this ability to change and this development of like a sense of morality and a person's conscience, I want to quote something you've said or you wrote about Tony Russo and your relationship with him. You say, quote, "One of the reasons I was so drawn to him was he was willing to give up everything, and did. He could have been a super successful aeronautical space engineer. He had this huge career, and then he went to Vietnam and he couldn't live with it, and he changed his life to try and stop it." It's worth underlining the heroism of both Tony Russo and Daniel Ellsberg. Not that many people, or not enough people, are willing to sacrifice at that level. And
Yeah.
I get why you would have been enamored with him and drawn to him, especially as an impressionable young woman in her mid-20s who was an anti-war activist and was, appalled by what was happening in Vietnam.
Yeah. I mean, idealism is very attractive and sacrifice is attractive. I mean, for the right reasons. And, and because, I don't know, because there seems to be so little of it around, or it seems to have been, I mean, that horrible word snowflake that's used to describe people who have ideals and principles and so on, has become the sort of shorthand as a way of mocking that. But it's really important. I mean, if you think of all the historical figures that we venerate still, I mean, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, et cetera, that's who they were. And that's what they were willing to give up everything. I mean, MLK lost his life and Gandhi did too. I mean, they were willing to sacrifice for something they believed in.
Well, and it's also like Martin Luther King, it's worth pointing out, was like in the public opinion realm, was not a popular man in his time.
Yeah.
In the United States. He was very unpopular, broadly speaking, for what he was doing.
Yeah. Well, so, Ellsberg and Russo, there was a lot of resistance to them too. I mean, there were certainly from the government and in general. I mean, I think one of the things that was such a horrible disappointment to Tony was that within months after the Pentagon Papers blew, Nixon was elected in a landslide. So what just happened?
Yeah, that had to have been, I was not alive. This was just before my time, but like the Nixon win in 1972 over McGovern, right? I'm placing this in
Mhm.
time right. That was, I think, the most lopsided landslide in American history.
It was pretty bad.
How demoralizing was that for
It
people of the
was
political
terrible.
left?
It was terrible. It was terrible. And then, because also, I mean, when Watergate happened, which was only, what, 2 years later, right? About 2 years later, it wasn't, what do I want to say? The way it happened was like fascinating and riveting. I mean, we all watched the Watergate here. They were like the best TV. But because of what our feeling we had about Nixon's character, it wasn't that much of a shock. We knew that there was some shady, but but now he's one of the most beloved presidents in American history. So go figure. I
Who,
mean,
Nixon?
yeah. Oh yeah. When they do these surveys, Nixon and Reagan almost always come out on top.
Jeez.
I know.
Wait, and he resigned. Did he resign in 73 or 74? What?
73 or 74, I can't remember. I think he
Yeah.
resigned and then the Watergate, I can't remember the exact sequence of events, but
But it was right around the time of your move to San
yeah,
Francisco, is the
yeah.
point.
No,
And
after. It was after. Because I remember after I left, I was living with some friends in Connecticut, and we were watching the Watergate hearings on TV. So it was a bit after.
you mention in the book more than once this line from, I believe, Henry James about how writers are people upon whom nothing is lost. And you sort of were thinking of that line as you self-evaluated in the early days of your career as a novelist and a writer of books. And you mentioned earlier too that when you were with Tony, you were not thinking of your time with him in any kind of literary sense. You weren't thinking like, oh, this is material. Those two notions seem to be in contradiction to one another. To not be a person upon whom anything is lost, and then to be sitting next to this like Vietnam era whistleblower and being like, nah, I'm not going to write a book about it.
Yeah, well, I think it was partly because the idea of writing any kind of memoir was so far. It did take me 50 years or almost 50 years. It was just foreign to my nature, whatever that is. And I couldn't. Someone asked me this, whether I'd ever considered writing it as fiction, writing this relationship or whatever it was, or this. And the answer was no, because it was very important to me that happened. So that the Pentagon Papers happened, that Watergate happened, that those things, that Tony was a historical figure and not someone that I'd made up. So yeah.
Well, I feel like oftentimes works of personal narrative, memoir, nonfiction benefit from time and perspective. I'm curious to know your thoughts on that. Like, so much time has passed between, it's like what, 50 years ago that this all
Yeah.
happened. And to have the benefit of all of that hindsight, it must have given some things to the book that would not otherwise have been there. Can you pinpoint?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I, you know, I mean, one of the things about being in your 20s is that the terror and confusion about how your life is going to work out is present at every moment. I mean, it's really like this kind of cloud of uncertainty that you're walking around in. And when you reach my age, I'm pretty sure how my life has worked out. It has worked out it's worked out a certain way. So there's a kind of calm that wasn't there at the time, and call it perspective or that I was able to write from. I mean, when I think about my favorite memoirs, so they're almost all written later. I mean, I think a lot about Harry Cruise's memoir, which title is now, it's like, what is that? My Life or something, about Harry Cruise's memoir, which is an insanely great book about growing up in the most hard scrabble part of Georgia. And it's a book about a kid. I mean, he eventually became a writer, but a kid who, as far as you can tell, was trying to like really hurt himself sort of by accident from birth. He fell into the hog boiler when he was 6 years old and all his skin fell off, blah, 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 blah. But it couldn't have been written when he was 20. It had to be written later in his life when he saw, you see I mean, being later in time allows you to see certain patterns that emerge. Also, in terms of forgiving myself, my relationship or whatever it was with Tony didn't end that well. He went mad in public and I just basically ditched him. I couldn't handle it. I just left. And in the middle of this kind of, public mad scene. And for a long time, I was very unforgiving of myself for having done that. Because I thought no matter how weird our relationship was and blah, 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 he was my friend. He was my friend. And now if I saw a friend of mine obviously losing it in public, I would stick around to help. There were people there. He had lawyers there. His agent was there, but it wasn't like I, left in the middle of nowhere. But again, the perspective of time allows me to think I was young. I was young and I was really not, well, the way you put it, I didn't have quite the sense of conscience and the courage that I have now. Now I would have thought, I've seen people be crazier a lot, since then. But at the time, it was more than I could handle.
Well, the relationship, as we mentioned earlier, was a little bit odd. A lot of these long drives, a lot of this, like, where do we stand? Are we like into each other? Are we just friends? Because he was not making moves really. And then there was like something like awkward, not great sex that you describe in the book, but it never really ascended to the level of like a solid romantic relationship. It was always kind of a question mark, right?
Yeah. No, it's really fun writing about bad sex. It's so much easier than writing about good sex. And the funny thing about that passage was that I was actually writing about good sex in the guise of writing about bad sex, because I kept saying, I wish I could say it was the kind of sex that blah, 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 but it wasn't. It really wasn't. No, there was never a moment when I thought, this is the love of my life. I'm going to spend my life with this guy. It was never like that. But again, at that age, it was like, let's see what this is like. Let's try this out. Let's be this person for a while. There was so much kind of fluidity, and once you start having kids, which I did, as I say, 4 years later, for their sake, you want to be one person. It's like, like mom's a little weird today because she's like not recognizable from what she was yesterday. That was over. That was really over. So, and that was fine with me.
And Tony, like, speaking of being multiple people, there were a lot of fluctuations in his behavior and temperament. In your observation of him, he was a bit paranoid. I think it's fair to say, but like maybe rightfully so. Like I didn't, like, it didn't seem crazy to me that he would be wondering if he was being surveilled.
They were tapping his phones. That was pretty clear. And also they were and are surveilling people who did a lot less than Tony did. So, that didn't seem paranoid to me. I did look back on the empty streets of San Francisco and know that there was nobody actually following us. But I didn't blame him for, they were throwing the garbage around the alley behind his house in LA day after day after day, singling him out. So somebody said, let's do it. So there were, and he'd been in jail. He was in jail for 47 days and he was tortured in jail. So he had enough reason to be, I don't know if I'd call even parent, to be wary of what was happening to him.
You think that he was mentally ill? Like I guess a question that arose for me is like, was there mental illness that he was dealing with that might have preceded the Pentagon Papers, but that was then exacerbated by the experience of the aftermath?
I don't know. I think you have to have your thing pretty together to become an aeronautical space engineer. They're not, maybe I realize that there are a lot of people that are narrowly focused, and let's say, or you could probably, I mean, probably there are people on one end of the spectrum, let's say, that could probably be aeronautical space engineers because it takes a certain kind of focus and concentration. But he was he was extremely high functioning. I mean, as a statistical analyst and and a space engineer working for NASA, if he was nuts, he did a pretty good job of concealing it. And then, but I do think that it was Vietnam that really put him over the edge. I mean, as I say in the book, the phrase PTSD, or the diagnosis, wasn't really current then. I mean, there have been so many different terms for what that, battle fatigue or shell shock or so forth. The thing that happens to people when they come back from war and are just so permanently shocked by what they've seen.
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, it's hard to imagine that he didn't have some form of PTSD.
Yeah, yeah. And as I say in the book, I've known a couple of other guys who were in Vietnam who were remarkably similar in a certain way. I mean, they would cry at certain intervals in the conversation in the same way that Tony did, or repeat the same stories. And so it began to seem to me like, something that happened, like a condition that could happen to people who were there.
So a lot of the conversations that you had with Tony that are depicted in the book, there was kind of a lingua franca between you guys when it came to like movies and books. And the movie Vertigo, Hitchcock's Vertigo, is something that you delve into at length in the book. It's a very important movie for you. Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow, The I Ching. But I want to start with Vertigo because it's set in San Francisco. It's your favorite film.
It's my favorite film. It's still my favorite film.
Why?
Why? Well, I just saw an article that someone wrote about the plot holes in it, as if I didn't know. Because it's like it's like any real work of art. I mean, every time, I've seen it probably 15 times. Every time, and I say this, I mean, every time I see it, I see something that I didn't see before. And it's about obsession, which to a certain extent 1974 is about, and which I'm endlessly interested in. And also it's very beautiful. I mean, driving around San Francisco and Kim Novak and it started very early when I was a kid. I mean, really a little kid. We had a subscription to Life magazine, and they had the graphics for Vertigo. Because it was that spiral thing. It was a opening credits. And I remember seeing it as a really little kid, and there was something about it, and I thought, this is something I'd like. I don't know, maybe I was 6 or 7. Came out in 58, so I was like 11. That there was something about it that drew me in, and also I was a child Hitchcock fan. I mean, I got fired as a babysitter for taking the kids to see Psycho. So, lost my job. So, and I love the film. And also, again, as I say, I mean, I used to think about how it was about, men preferring that women be like these ice queens, like Kim Novak plays in the thing. And, even literally unconscious, which she is for part of the film. And then, again, as I say, I mean, there's that moment in the film where Madeline, his beloved, is dead, and he sees Judy on the street, and she looks so much like Madeline. She reminds him of her, and it reminded me. I mean, now when I first saw Vertigo, most of the people I knew were alive. And now I know a lot of people who are dead. And I see them on the street all the time. I go, oh, there's blah, blah. How can that possibly be? They died 5 years ago. So, and I've never seen anything that quite got it like that quite got that sensation of like, how could this be happening? And of course, in the movie, there's a slightly leaden and not very believable explanation for how this does happen. But nonetheless, it's a moment of in which it does happen. The one thing I say in the book that I know is not true, which is that the idea for the book began during a screening of Vertigo at BART. They had a screening, and it was amazing. It was on a full screen in the Fisher Center, and they had a live orchestra playing Bernard Herrmann's score. It was really astonishing. And for some reason, I don't know. I thought it would be a good idea to take my granddaughters, who were like 6 and 10 or 8 and 12. I can't remember, but they were little girls. Why I thought they would like Vertigo or but I did think that it would probably be the only chance they would have to see this film with a live orchestra. And they both got it. I mean, they both got it. The little one thought she was going to be scared, but then she wasn't, and they both got it. So in the book, I say that, I mean, the true thing is that I started crying during the performance, and my younger granddaughter comforted me. The thing I say, which isn't true, is that that's when I decided to write the book. I mean, it was a whole other time, as I said at the beginning of this. But it was just, and then when I saw it with them, for example, I thought the way the score, because the score was so present. I mean, it was, I realized in a way that I'd never realized before, having seen it by then 12 times or whatever, how much the score influenced everything. So, I mean, really how much it influenced your psychology watching the movie. I mean, just the sort of ascending and descending notes. And one of my sons is a musician, so I made him like go over the themes and tell me like where the thirds are and where the ascending notes. So I really thought about it as a piece of music and how that had changed it. So the movie seems kind of inexhaustible to me. I mean, that is, I'll keep going to it and I'll keep seeing things there that hadn't occurred to me before.
And that maybe that's like as good a definition of what a great work of art is.
Yeah.
Is that every time you go back to it, you get something new, and it's sort of inexhaustible. It's like a well you can always go back to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this past fall, I taught Jane Eyre and Great Expectations in my Bard class, two books I thought I knew. And I was constantly finding things that I had never noticed before. So, yeah.
And what year was Vertigo released?
I think 58. I think, late 1950s, certainly.
Okay, so this isn't of kind of personal interest, but I want to talk to you about it because it seems like, as you depicted in the book, your love of Vertigo and your sort of relationship to the film is connected to your relationship to San Francisco as a place, because Vertigo is set in San Francisco, but it's set in a San Francisco that precedes the San Francisco that you lived in. Mm-hmm. So it has this kind of, it's the same but different. It's maybe got a bit of a shinier veneer. It's depicting maybe like, I always feel like the halcyon days are before. You never catch them. Maybe you caught them. I've never caught them. Every time
they were gone. They were already gone. I mean, there's that scene where Kim Novak comes out of her apartment building and she's wearing this and she like swoops into her bottle green Jaguar. The doorman is there. And it's it's Pacific Heights. I mean, it's a kind of San Francisco. I mean, I guess there's still like an old San Francisco, but San Francisco, it's not like that. I mean, for example, the homelessness situation, well, in LA too now, it's California, it was not there then. I mean, it wasn't. And every time I've gone there since, I mean, when you go there on book tour, they put you in a hotel downtown, like a couple of blocks from Union Square. And I would just look out my window and there were just these heartbreaking meth heads congregating on the corner. And that certainly wasn't true in 1974. I mean, there were other things going on, and certainly there was a lot of heroin going on, but it didn't have that feeling of the kind of, well, that there were these people living in these insanely beautiful high rises or mansions, and then there was this vast army of people living on the street.
Well, here's where my own personal frame of reference comes into play, because I think I have a relationship to a San Francisco movie that is not Vertigo, but is somewhat similar. And it is also it's Zodiac. And it's also, I got to say, I was raised partially in the Bay Area when I was very young. So I was like 2 and 3 years old, and we lived outside of San Francisco. But when I saw Zodiac, and whenever I see Zodiac, there is something so weirdly familiar about the aesthetic
Hmm.
of that film that I don't know if it's because, am I going from photos that I've seen in old photo albums, or is it some lived experience that's like embedded in my wiring that it is evoking? But I'm curious to know, as somebody who lived in San Francisco in the 70s, if you've seen Zodiac and if the San Francisco that it depicts visually squares with your memories.
This is so amazing because about 2 weeks ago, a friend said to me, "You need to see Zodiac right now." And I haven't seen it. I saw it when it came out, so I have only a dim memory. But my friend said, essentially what you just said. I need to know whether that's what it was like.
Right.
So, other things have come up since then, but actually, I'm writing it down.
Yeah, I mean,
So, yeah,
I'll say this: if it's not how it actually was, it is a very beautiful film. You kind of
yeah.
wish that it was like that. There's something really gorgeous, but also a little bit haunting about San Francisco in the way that it's,
Oh, yeah.
photographed.
Well, it was. It was an incredibly romantic city. I mean, you go out to Coit Tower and the fog would be rolling in. In the same way when in Vertigo, when Scotty chases Madeline up to under the shadow, the bay, under the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge, it's like, it's so romantic. But I don't feel that when I go there now, or the last couple of times I've been there. It just seems like a city.
Yeah, it's like I think there's something sad because for me it's like it's such a beautiful place. You can't deny that. Like the beauty of San Francisco is undeniable. That bay, those bridges, the mountains, it's just gorgeous and probably the most gorgeous city in America. But I feel like a lot of its soul has been lost. And
Yeah.
it's
Well,
hard not to mourn that.
the Mission and below Market Street, that was just, it was so, and also it was still like very much an immigrant community down. I mean, you could get like amazing Salvadoran food, which you couldn't get anywhere else in there. And now it's just like, because big tech companies came in, and that was that.
That was that. Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about like your writing life because you've had a pretty remarkable career. I mean, just the fact that in this book you're barely 26 years old, 25, 26 years old, and you've got a book published and another one on the way. You have been working and publishing steadily pretty much ever since. I'm curious to just hear your perspective on all of it. Like looking back, how has publishing changed in the time that you've been working as a writer? Just kind of like your thoughts on your career from this vantage.
Well, I mean, it's changed in some good ways and some bad ways. I mean, the good ways, there's this story in the book about my first publisher at Athenaeum saying to me, "You didn't write this whole book all by yourself, did you?" And no one is going to talk, I don't think, to a young woman writer that way anymore. So the sexism and the racism that were just endemic in publishing are better. I mean, I don't think any of that has been completely ended, but it's certainly better. And if it's not better, people are more careful about it. I mean, and and the lists of what's published are diverse, more interesting, different age groups, different races, different economic groups. I mean, it's, in that way, it seems much better to me. What seems less good is that I feel such a gap between so-called literary fiction and so-called commercial fiction, much more than I did then. I mean, when I was a kid, I mean, I just read everything. I mean, that's why I'm a writer. I was just like the minute I learned to read, that's all I wanted to do. And when I was a kid, I read all these big bestsellers, Gone with the Wind and Exodus and James Michener books. And I didn't know that they were like cheesy. I just thought they were books. I didn't know if someone had asked me to explain the difference between Gone with the Wind and Anna Karenina, I would say, well, they're both about the same length. I have a lot of characters. But now, I mean, for example, the popularity of these romantasy books and so forth. I don't, where they're like sort of semi-erotic books about dragons and wizards and stuff, stuff like that. I really don't get it. I don't get, and it's not that I feel superior, I swear. It's just that I don't get why people would be interested, why they would find it interesting. So I didn't feel that then. I mean, when I would see, books on the bestseller list when I was a kid or, beginning to write, I could read them. I mean, James Gould Cousins, the writers of the 50s, John O'Hara, they were very readable, no matter what you thought of their whatever. And now I think there's this huge gap between quote unquote serious literature and quote unquote commercial fiction. I don't know, or beach books or whatever, there's rom-coms and stuff like that, which is a pity. And also I think it's just like, it goes along with the sort of general what's happened to our educational system. I think books that are hard, it's just people are they're not going to go out and read books that are difficult.
Do you, having written this memoir, have a desire to continue with nonfiction? Do you think there will be other works of nonfiction?
Well, nonfiction for sure. Memoir, I'm not so sure. Memoir, memoir, not so much. But nonfiction, yeah. I mean, there are always things that interest me. So, yeah.
And I want to know, too, like, this is a book that not only evokes a specific time and place and era in your life and in the life of the country, but it's also, for me, a book that had me reflecting on the past as it relates to the present. You must be aware that there are through lines that connect what you were going through in 1973 and 74 in your relationship with Anthony Russo and what you were learning then about him, about the country, and about yourself, and kind of where we are now in this like really scary season of political tumult. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you mentioned paranoia before, but, were it not paranoia, I mean, the sense that, for example, whatever is happening is not going to end well. I mean, that was, in the 60s, we were sure there was going to be like free education and healthcare and people would work different jobs and blah, 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 blah. And by the 70s, it was clear that this was not going to happen. It was not going to. And then as soon as guys like Richard Nixon got in the White House, there was a sense that people had plans for us that we weren't going to like. And that's certainly the feeling that I have now. So that in that way, it's very much the same.
And having lived through, like, generationally, that idealism and then that kind of collision with harder realities, and then maybe the abandoning of ideals that might not characterize you necessarily, but could characterize other people in your generation, having sort of like ridden that wave from like cresting to crashing, the whole ride. How do you perceive of, I guess, your own generation's lived experience with the benefit of hindsight and like where we are now? Like, are you optimistic or do you feel that?
I wish I were, Brad. I really wish I were. I really wish I were. I mean, maybe I think the next few years are going to be really hard. So in the short term, I'm not super optimistic. And my generation, I mean, I can't remember if I say this in the book or not, but when I graduated in 68 from Harvard, the Shah of Iran was the graduation speaker. And we protested graduation. We wore these black armbands and we didn't go. And 25 years later, I went back to my reunion and Colin Powell was the graduation speaker. And he had just passed the Don't Ask, Don't Tell, been behind it in the military. And my class were all like sucking up to Colin Powell. And I'm going, okay, this is a little weird. And then at some point during these ceremonies or whatever, in the 25th, they announced how much money my class had given to Harvard. And believe me, none of it was mine. And I suddenly got it. that this was, that I, surprise, had gone to this ruling class feeder school, and somehow it hadn't occurred to me. But I think that that's what happened. I mean, we had, and certainly it happened to me. I mean, I had a family, I had a house, I had bills to pay, and it wasn't as if I suddenly became not an idealistic person. I still think of myself that way, but I was certainly less. I wasn't going to go to jail for it. I had 2 kids to take care of.
So, as you have mentioned, both Tony Russo and Daniel Ellsberg are no longer with us. Tony died in 2008, and Ellsberg died, a year ago?
A year ago.
Was the project of writing and then publishing this book related at all to the fact that they are no longer with us? Would it have changed your publication schedule or anything like that? Were Daniel Ellsberg still alive, or?
No, because I didn't say anything that wasn't true. And also, there have been several biographies written of Ellsberg or about that time or about that, Pentagon Papers. And many of the, what do I want to say? The sort of factual points on which that story is hung in my memoir are out there. So it wasn't as if I was, inventing history or reinventing history. I mean, they're established facts. So I wasn't inventing something new and libelous.
There's a great line of yours where you say, like, when you write personal narrative, nonfiction, memoir, like the danger posed by it, I'm paraphrasing, is that you might learn some things about yourself that you didn't want to know. Is there anything about yourself in this process that you learned that you didn't want to know?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that shocked me most was, I was looking, I mean, this is in the book. I was looking to see if I had any letters from Tony because, that was back when people wrote letters. And I found this pack of letters from various boyfriends whom I ghosted before ghosting was a thing. They seemed not to know that we'd broken up, and I'll get these letters saying, like, where are you? And, I would be very upset if I heard my granddaughter did that, or if, I don't know, my son's, that's a whole other story. But, so, my sense of myself as having always been sort of a nice, thoughtful person, that changed quite a bit. But, I have since I've since changed my ways. I feel that I treat people better than I did then. But I wasn't, I'm not flailing around them now the way I was then.
You were like at the vanguard. You're like the vanguard of ghosting.
I was pre-ghosted, ghosting.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I always ask people at the end of our time together if they are working on anything else. It's fine if you're not, but I'm just curious if you have another book in the pipeline.
Yeah, I'm working on a novel. I'm working on a long novel, and it takes place in 1867 in the UK. Yeah.
Heavy research.
Yes and no. There's yes and yes and then no. I mean, there's a certain amount of imaginative, because to write a novel, you have to get into the heads of people that you were not. So there's there are facts that anchor the thing, but then the rest is just like,
Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you, to meet you, and I appreciate the time. Congratulations on 1974. It's a wonderful book, and I wish you well with this next project.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brett.